Hyperbole is defined as an extravagant overstatement. As a rhetorical device, it's used to do exactly that. So its function is to overstate things in either a very positive way or alternatively a very negative way. Now, we have to be careful to distinguish between hyperbole and something that merely looks like hyperbole. There can be cases where the language can be very strong, it can be describing things that are very extreme, but they could be completely accurate. So hyperbole is not simply being, extreme, it's that it's an extreme or extravagant overstatement. So if someone, describes that a professor who assigns a 2-page paper as, being a tyrant and, imposing crushing burdens, that'd be a hyperbole. But if we were talking about a government that is like executing its people, and we talk about it being tyranny and a crushing oppression, then that could be quite an accurate description. So you can't always go just by the words being extreme. You have to look at the accuracy of the statement. Now, there are many ways hyperbole can be used. Dysphemisms, where you make something look, something neutral or positive, look negative, can involve hyperbole. Persuasive comparisons, not surprisingly, often involve hyperbole, comparing something to, a person to something like extreme. So, for example, comparing someone to Hitler, who's not actually like Hitler, would be a persuasive comparison involving hyperbole. Rhetorical explanations and rhetorical definitions we looked at earlier can often involve hyperbole. Ridicule, the horse laugh, ridicule, sarcasm, which we looked at earlier, can also involve hyperbole as well. So, in addition to being, having potentially a direct effect on people, hyperbole can also have subtle or even subconscious effects. A person might reject an excessive claim, but still be influenced by it. For example, we're heading into an election season, and we'll see, political attack ads that will often be quite hyperbolic, attributing to political opponents or political parties all sorts of, terrible, terrible things. And some of these might actually be true, but in many cases they will be mere hyperbole. But even if a person doesn't, believe, for example, that a particular candidate is destroying America and is going to, put everyone in jail or something, the ad could still affect them. They, impact them emotionally, and even though consciously they're aware it's probably all lies, that can affect their feelings. On the positive side, a person may not believe all the hype about a movie or a show, etc., but all the hype might affect them emotionally. They might feel positive towards it, or at the very least be curious enough to, to view it or, buy it. So for hyperbole, again, the definition is an extravagant overstatement. In terms of, on the side of good, defending against it, the thing to do is ask, but is this actually accurate? Does this overstatement, is it really an overstatement, or is it an accurate description? And as always, when we're attempting to look at things critically, we'd want to try to be as neutral as possible, keeping in mind that there can be things that are in fact quite extreme and can be accurately described that way. On the side of evil, hyperbole can be quite useful. Again, even if people don't believe, for example, that a political candidate intends to, get rid of all hamburgers and make you ban your car and etc., people can still be affected by that. And hyperbolic and outright lies can be quite effective psychologically. So on the side of evil, this can be quite useful. Now, there is a risk, of course, that the hyperbole might reach a point where it's just so absurd that it not only doesn't work, that it could have a negative effect. Although in today's hyperpartisan and absurd times, it may be difficult to find something that is too extreme. Heading on to Rhetorical Devices, Part 4, we have our old friends, the Rhetorical Definitions, which we saw previously, and of course, Rhetorical Explanations. So rhetorical definitions, the definition is not changed from our previous look at it. And these are definitions that are used to convey or evoke an attitude about the defined term and its denotation. You might recall the connotation is what the term refers to, and the denotation is the emotional, loading of the term, be it positive or negative. And as you might imagine, people can use rhetorical definitions to load things negative or load things positive. For example, the political, ethical, and legal debate over abortion, one side might define abortion as the murder of an unborn child, and this, of course, is strongly loaded negative because murder is, we typically see that as bad, and describing it as an unborn child makes it seem even worse. Now, a definition of a surgical procedure that is a matter of the woman's choice is a rhetorical definition that is positive, because it defines it as a surgical procedure and presents it as a matter of choice. Now, as you might imagine, depending on a person's view of the issue, the definitions may not seem rhetorical at all. So if someone believes that abortion is the murder of an unborn child, they would probably say, no, that is simply the correct definition. And someone who believes that it's a surgical procedure that's a matter of choice, they would probably say, no, that's completely accurate. It's the other side that is rhetorical. Now, in moral debates, if we're looking at them, not politically, not from the standpoint of, engaging in political action, looking at them from the standpoint of a neutral assessment, we, of course, would want to define our terms neutrally, as neutral as possible. And, of course, this becomes a matter of contention when the terms and issues may be something that is already kind of morally fraught. But in general, we'd want to try to be as neutral as possible when we're trying to settle the matter from the standpoint of philosophy and ethics. And this, of course, applies quite broadly. Now, in the case of rhetorical explanations, this is, not surprisingly, an explanation that's not intended primarily to convey understanding, to lead us from not knowing or not understanding to understanding, but to affect our attitudes or influence our behavior. Now, of course, an explanation that's rhetorical could also function as an explanation, but its primary function is, invoking attitudes or feelings or affecting behavior. So a person might say something like, in response to a question like, why was the request rejected? A person might say, well, it was a reasonable request that would have solved some important problems. That's why the politicians rejected it. Or someone might say, to try to explain why the country is in trouble, they might say, why is the country in trouble? Well, people are moving, further and further away from traditional values. People knew once what was wrong and what was right. Now people just want to grab all they can and to hell with everyone else. This has put us on the fast track to disaster. And that'd be a rhetorical explanation. Now you might contend that, either of these explanations might be turned to be true, but they're, quite clearly designed to create a feeling or affect behavior. Now, in some cases, of course, as always, there could be the question of a explanation may seem like it's trying to influence behavior because it may provide an explanation that makes, say, someone seem really bad or really good, but it could in fact be accurate. And so you'd want to look at the context. Now, as a practical thing for things like exam questions and assignment questions, you can kind of assume if it's, an explanation is kind of heavily loaded, that it would most likely be a rhetorical explanation. So, in the case of rhetorical analogies, these are, of course, analogies. Now we'll look at a variety of types of analogies throughout the course of the course. For example, we'll look at explanatory analogy, which makes a comparison in order to enhance people's understanding, to clarify, etc. We'll also look at the argument by analogy, and when you get to the later part talking about inductive arguments, where we compare two things in order to say that because two things are alike in certain ways, they're alike in another way. But our concern here is with the rhetorical analogy. And this involves comparing one thing to another thing to make one of them appear to be better or worse, to make it look good or bad. And there are both negative and positive comparisons. For example, when we're talking about people, for most people, the most negative possible comparison would be to compare someone to Hitler or a Nazi. And that kind of rhetorical analogy, unless someone is like a Nazi or white supremacist, would be a very negative comparison. We can also make positive comparisons. We might say that someone is as brave as a lion. Or if we're comparing people to people, we might compare a person, to someone who has a well-known quality. Like if you say that someone is as smart as Einstein, then that would be a positive comparison. Now, a rhetorical analogy, by its very nature, would not be an argument, because in the case of an actual argument by analogy, one is comparing two things, saying they're alike in certain ways, and because of these similarities, they're probably alike in this other way. More of that in part 3. The rhetorical analogy says this thing is like this thing, and by comparing it to something bad or something good, you're supposed to feel good or bad. They don't require a lot of effort, but they can be very effective, which is why, again, often when people are, debating, quickly they often go to like Nazi comparisons or Holocaust comparisons, even when it's totally, inaccurate and inappropriate. Now, these rhetorical comparisons or rhetorical analogies do include things like metaphors and similes, but we won't get into the distinctions, the fine distinctions. We'll just go with rhetorical analogy as comparing things. So if someone is comparing two things rhetorically to make something appear better or worse, a rhetorical analogy. And these could be things like that person's complaints were like the yippings of a tiny dog, or their ethics were on par with those of Stalin, or that person's voice was as smooth as broken glass. Or for positive things, you might say something like their integrity is as solid as the mountains, or they are as smart as Einstein, or you can make like athletic comparisons. Like if you compare someone's tennis ability to that of Serena Williams, that would be praise. Now on to misleading comparisons. Now, not surprisingly, as we go through life, we will make comparisons ourselves, and we'll also hear comparisons. This often occurs in advertising, where they'll say things like, 25% larger, or quietest by far, or the classic new and improved, or now better than ever, or works better, plays better. Now, in these comparisons, the question, of course, is what does that actually mean? Now, in many cases, going back to our old friend vagueness, which is something that's lacking in precision, the amount of vagueness in a comparison that is acceptable depends quite a bit on the context. So what could be perfectly reasonable and not misleading at all in one context may be too vague in another. For example, suppose you buy a house and you're considering, insulating your attic. And according to the information, it will cut your utility bill, electrical bill for heating, say 15 to 45%. And of course that's, pretty general, pretty vague, but it would probably give you, enough reason to insulate, because if it's in that range, 15 to 45, probably worth it. Now, there are, of course, some claims that are just too vague to even be really meaningful, like have more fun in Arizona, or gets clothes whiter than white, what would that mean, or delivers more tasteful taste. One can also mislead with various graphics. So our chart might distort a graphic by expanding the scale at a certain point, making a misleading comparison. Another common trick is misleading percentages. And these may be done just kind of innocently. The person's not really realizing that their comparison is misleading. It may be done intentionally to sort of, get attention on the story, attract eyeballs or ears, as the case may be. Or it may actually be done with rather, malign intent, intending to deceive. For example, suppose someone says there was a 166% increase in cocaine use among Americans aged 12 to 17 back between 1992 and 1995. Now, of course, that may seem pretty extreme. 166% sounds like a lot. And psychologically, we would tend to think, that's huge. But we'd have to have the comparison in order to know, like, okay, it's 166% increase, but 166% of what? So the actual number here was there was an increase, but it went from 0.3 to 0.8. And that is true. That is a 166% increase, but that's not that scary. So if someone were to have a story saying cocaine use increased from 0.3 to 0.8%, people would say, well, that's an increase, but that's pretty tiny. But 166% sounds scary. So be wary of numbers without, a context, especially when they're scary. Now, looking at comparisons, there are 4 useful questions to ask. So the first question to ask, if it's important, is to ask if important information is missing or not. And again, context can make a huge difference. So suppose that one learned that 10% of all child abuse cases involved alcoholics. Now, just looking at that number, a person may think, wow, that's pretty strange, but it sounds like 90% of abuse is done by non-alcoholics. Therefore, it would seem that alcoholics are actually less abusive. And so if you're looking for someone, to say, if you're a parent looking for someone to babysit your children, you'd want to get someone who is an alcoholic. Now, we know that's counterintuitive, so we know there's probably something going on here. And the answer is this. Although it sounds like, just look straight at the numbers, 10% is done by alcoholics, the number you need to know is what percentage of the population is alcoholic. So suppose that 3% of the population would be classified as alcoholic, and they account for 10% of all child abuse. In that case, this matches our likely intuition that alcoholics are much more likely to be abusive because they're 3% of the population, in this example, accounting for 10% of abuse cases. Another example, suppose there's a report that fewer people are suffering from a serious disease. Let's say someone reports that, COVID cases are down. Now, normally that would seem to be good news, unless we find out that the reduced numbers were due to the deaths resulting from the disease. So if we were to say there were fewer cases of COVID because people were dying, that would be bad news rather than good news. Other examples, this is sometimes used as like humorous, things. But then they'd say, for example, that 9% of all heroin addicts once use cocaine. And they'll often, I don't mean the heroin and cocaine stuff as part of the joke, but what people often do is say, like something, silly like 95% of people used heroin had ate carrots or listened to the Beatles or something. And the point is that if someone says like most people, like most heroin addicts use cocaine, without additional information, that is not particularly meaningless because it's likely that 90% of heroin addicts also or more ate like carrots or played a video game or something. Another example, suppose one thing that's often discussed is Social Security, how it's supposedly to be, doomed. There's only a few people, supporting each retiree. And what people will typically say is back when Social Security began, there were 42 workers for every people working for every person on Social Security, and now it's it's much less, say like 3 to 1. Now, of course, the problem there is that without context, you don't know if this is like really bad or really terrible. So if we find out that the say 3 to 1 ratio has been going along for decades, that would be less concerning. We would say, okay, yeah, it's very different now, but is this a problem? Second question. is the same standard comparison being used, and are the same reporting and recording techniques also being employed? For example, it may be reported that unemployment, say, decreased, and that would seem to be like a good thing. But this could be because of a redefinition in the term unemployment. So, for example, if people who are not working but have given up looking for work are now counted as not being unemployed, despite the fact they could be working, that would make the comparison misleading. Because you would normally think if unemployment goes down, your natural intuition is that that means more people are employed. You wouldn't automatically think, they've redefined unemployment, so that's why it went down. Another example, like with diseases. One thing that's been a big debate about in COVID, at least among people who don't do like medicine and science, is how one defines, say, a death from COVID. And if we see like a sudden increase in deaths from a disease, one question might be, has it been the case that more people are actually dying of this disease or condition, or was it redefined? For example, to use a historical example, in 1993, there was a sudden increase in about 50,000 new AIDS cases. And a person may think, wow, there's just this huge spike. But the result was primarily due to the government redefining the disease. So one problem is that in the case of diseases, people may, for political reasons, they may define the disease a certain way or define deaths a certain way, and a shift could result in seemingly like a sudden increase or decrease in cases. So you want to make sure that terms are being used consistently. Another example, a final example would be historical data involving, medicine, where we might wonder, like, are there more cases of cancer or autism compared to the past? And part of the problem would be, if we're making comparisons to the past, is there may be changes in the names for diseases, and there may be, better methods of detecting them today. So someone who died in the past, may be listed as dying of something because they had no idea they died of like a cancer we can identify today. And so you'd always want to make sure that, the things are in fact, that the same standards are being used. A third question is, are the items actually comparable? For example, if we're comparing tourism in a country, say now with pre-pandemic, that would obviously, we really can't compare them fairly. Another example involving the pandemic, it became, and probably still is, like a major political talking point by some that crime, shoplifting has skyrocketed. And some people are pushing a narrative that, the American cities are lawless, to advance some political agenda. Now, it is true that shoplifting did increase. However, comparing shoplifting, say, now data with during the height of the pandemic, that would obviously be extremely misleading, because during the lockdown, when people weren't shopping in person, ordering stuff online, shoplifting, not surprisingly, went way, way down. Now, of course, it seems like there was a huge, massive increase in shoplifting, but comparing, say, 2022 data to data from the height of the pandemic would be extremely misleading, which is exactly why certain political commentators do that. They know exactly what they're doing in their comparison, but of course, their purpose is to try to claim that crime has skyrocketed, when really it hasn't. Essentially, we're kind of back to, I don't want to call it normal, but back to the usual levels of shoplifting. You would have to compare it to make a meaningful comparison. We couldn't compare it now to, the depths of the lockdown. We have to compare it now to, back, pre-pandemic. Another example, comparing past athletic records with current records. Now, one thing that does occur, of course, is there have been improvements in athletic performance. And in some cases, this is because people are, in fact, performing better. One reason for this, if you look at, if you're a runner, it's kind of funny to look at it, but, You can see pictures of people like after running the marathon, way back in the 1900s, 1800s. People would be like smoking cigars, etc. And there really wasn't like a whole lot of training and so on. And so a lot has changed. And so if we're wondering, are people performing better today than in the past? The answer is generally yes. But if you raise the question, are humans better now? Are we better human beings now than we were in the past? And really, it'd be unfair to make that comparison because equipment has changed quite a bit. Training has improved dramatically, and also performance-enhancing drugs have been available as well. And so if we're comparing, say, past running records to current ones, we have to factor in various things. For example, if we go quite a ways back, tracks used to be often like dirt or cinder. When I was in high school, we ran on a dirt track. So it was quite a bit slower running on a dirt track than running on, a proper track. Also, running shoes have changed quite a bit. When I first started running, it was basically like running shoe, the early Nikes, and they did have spikes, spiky Nikes. Now they have all these, advanced technology shoes. They have special, drinks and gels and supplements, GPS watches, etc. make a big difference in training. And so if we're comparing current athletes with past athletes, the comparisons can be misleading. Is it the case that today's athletes are just so much better? Well, you have to look at, if you have someone running on a beautiful, track who fueled up with, scientifically designed, supplements and is running in, the new, Nike shoes, then yeah, they're going to run a faster time, but they might not actually be like a better athlete. They have better gear. Final example, comparing past prices to prices today. As people get older, they'll often say things like, when I was a kid, movies cost 10 cents, or a new car was $800, or something like that. And when making such comparisons, one has to consider the obvious thing of inflation. So, for example, I do remember when I was a kid, I would get like $1, and after church on Sunday, I could buy for $1, I could buy like 3 comic books and a candy bar. And of course, today $1 won't buy you, might buy you like a candy bar, maybe, or part of one. Now, of course, it's to make sense of that comparison, it's not really in a way a meaningful one because of inflation. So we need to consider those. A more important comparison would be the dispute over minimum wage. I remember when I was working minimum wage, it was like $3.25 an hour. Now it's like federal is like 7 something. And of course, it seems like it's more, but you've got to take into account a fair comparison. Because again, when I was making like $3.25 an hour, it was a little bit after like $1 would buy me, 4 comic books. And today, $1's not going to do that. So $7.50 today buys you a lot less than say three something back then. And so when we're having a debate over something like minimum wage, we just can't go by the straight numbers. Like, oh, the minimum wage is $7. It's increased from when I was a kid, so it's double. No, you have to look at the meaningful comparison. How much does, say, $7 buy today versus $3, many years ago? The final question 4, deals with comparisons involving averages. And when doing this, so the fourth thing is that when we're looking at comparisons expressed as an average, we would want to make sure that important information is not missing from this, because there are different types of averages to consider, and averages mean different things. For example, suppose after graduation you're picking between like a couple of jobs, and you're looking at, they both seem to pay pretty decent benefits, etc. And it's come down to which city do you want to live in. And suppose you're looking at it and you note that the average rainfall in 2 cities are the same. And if you just, pick one based on that, it may turn out that the experience can be quite different. So two cities could have the same average rainfall, and one could have like a lot of rain in a short time, like certain times of the year, and the rest of the year be like beautiful and sunny. And the other city might just have low, not that much rain, but just constant gray drizzle like all year. So they can be very different experiences. Similarly with things like the average, cost of a house in an area, they could be the same in two places, but very different experiences. And so we'd want to consider, again, if it matters, those factors. Now, there are, of course, putting things a bit simple, three basic types of averages. And it can get more complicated, obviously, if we're doing stats. But these are the mean, median, and mode. The mean is the one we typically think of. This is defined in this way. The mean of a group of numbers is a number that results when their sum is divided by the number of members in this group. So imagine you're looking at a job with a company, and they might have a mean salary of $41,000. But this could be due to the fact that they have, they may pay most people really badly and have a few executives getting huge salaries. Or it may be that, you would make good money. So you could have the same sets of numbers, but very different, the same exact means rather, and have very different sets of numbers. The median is also a type of average, and in a group of numbers, it's that midpoint. There's many numbers of the group larger and smaller relative to the median. So the same company, using the example, might have a median of 27,000, and the numbers, the numbers above it and the numbers below it, they could be radically different. So the numbers below 27,000 might be much lower. To use kind of an extreme, silly example, the numbers 1, 2, and 3, and 1, 2, and a billion technically have the same median. Now, obviously, when people do stats, they would, do some things more complicated, but that can show the median. You get the same median, but radically different sets of numbers. Lastly is the mode. The mode is also a type of average. In a group of numbers, it's a number that occurs the most frequently. So, for example, at our hypothetical company, the most common salary, the mode, might be 17,000. Now, again, you could have sets of numbers that are very different with the same mode. You could have, again, to use a silly made-up example, 1, 2, 2, 3, and 1, 2, 2, a billion, and they would have the same mode, but obviously very different sets of numbers. Now, of course, with real examples, it'd be more interesting, more complicated, but that shows that you could have same mean, median, mode, but very different sets of numbers. So when you're considering an average, you'd want to consider not only what type of average is it, but also factors such as, what does this actually mean in terms of your experience? Like the rainfall example being a good example. What does it mean to have an average rainfall of so many inches? Does that mean torrential downpours and then long periods of sun, or does it mean constant drizzle? And so it always, you always want to look at the details. Now to proof surrogates and repetition. Now a proof surrogate is this. It is when you use an expression to suggest there is evidence or authority for a claim, without actually saying there is or providing it. So essentially what you're offering is the reason they call it a proof surrogate is a surrogate is something that stands in for something else. So in this case, it's not real proof, it's a surrogate for proof. Now, this is not to say that like a surrogate mother is not really bearing the child, but the idea is the mother is standing in for someone else. In the case of a proof surrogate, it is standing in for actual proof, but it's not proof itself. In many cases, people use sort of like anonymous sources. They might say, informed sources say that Facebook will be broken up by the government. Well, you don't know who the informed sources are, and so there's really no proof there. Or a person might say, I have a book at home that says you're wrong. Well, without seeing the book, you don't know. Other examples would be things like sources close to the president say that he plans to consider raising taxes, or an inside source says that the singer will be retiring next year. Some may make also kind of vague references to studies or experts. They might say, studies show that getting children involved in music early leads them to doing well in school. Now that may be true, but without reference to the studies, you have no way of checking. It's not actual proof. Now again, if someone is actually citing the studies, then that's a different matter. Or if someone says, experts say that a diet rich in vegetables will make you healthier, well, that claim is true, but merely saying experts say would be a proof surrogate. Now, in normal everyday conversation of stuff, we typically don't cite our sources, and it'd be kind of odd to be talking to someone and they say studies say, and the study citations are, and they list them all out. That'd be kind of unusual. But one should be careful to distinguish between, say, informal conversation where you're just chatting and when you should believe something based on alleged evidence. And a proof surrogate is just that. It is not real proof. It's a suggestion of proof. And again, to emphasize this, that there are, of course, cases where people are just talking and you normally wouldn't cite your sources in a normal conversation. But if you're going to believe something or do something that has meaningful consequences, you would always want to find out the actual sources and check on them. So if you were going to change your diet based on what someone said, you'd want to check to see if that's actually a good idea. Or if a parent was deciding, should they get their children, involved heavily in music and buy an instrument and invest all this time, they probably want to go with more than just a friend saying, oh yeah, studies say this. Now on the side of good, the way to defend against it is, if it matters, just ask for the source. What is the actual proof? On the side of evil, it's very useful because someone can simply make up studies or use studies or experts that are supposedly real but are unqualified, and just present them. And people will often tend to believe that a study or an expert or they say, even though there's no proof being provided. Next, repetition. Now, apparently, repetition can be quite effective. The Nazi minister of propaganda has a famous quotable quote, which is, "The most brilliant propagandist technique will yield no success unless one fundamental principle is borne in mind constantly. It must confine itself to a few points and repeat them over and over." Vladimir Lenin, supposedly, who was a Russian revolutionary, supposedly said that a lie told often enough becomes the truth. Now, psychologically, this does seem to work. When people hear a claim over and over again, especially if it's like a simple talking point, people tend to believe. So the technique is exactly that. Make the point over and over through repetition, ideally, of course, keeping it simple. And today, of course, we call this talking points. And psychologically, it seems to eventually dull people's critical faculties, and they tend to believe through becoming accustomed. As to why this is the case, there can be a variety of reasons. It may be that psychologically, if we hear something enough times, we just sort of, and from many sources, we kind of take that as confirming it, hearing it from different sources multiple times. We may have a bias to thinking then that's probably a form of confirmation, when in fact it's not. Merely hearing it a lot means we merely hear it a lot. And again, the best examples of this is politics. Politicians will go or send their surrogates to lay out the talking points, and you'll often hear politicians or pundits saying exactly the same thing. And comedians occasionally will take clips of this and then do the split screen thing, and then split and split and split, and then have a whole vast split screen with dozens or maybe even hundreds of pundits saying word for word the exact same talking points. So the sign of good, the thing to do is be aware that merely saying a point over and over doesn't make the claim true. So if it's not likely to be true the first time you hear it, Simply repeating it over and over doesn't make it more likely to be true. On the side of evil, you'd want to repeat and repeat and repeat. Again, keep it simple and repeat it over and over. Now, on the side of neutral, if you want people to remember stuff, then yes, keep it simple, have a few points, like on a PowerPoint, and repeat quite a bit. And people are more likely to remember it. But that's a whole different objective than trying to get people to believe things. Persuasion through visual images. Now, images can be powerful, persuasive devices. But of course, an image itself is not a claim. It's not a statement that can be true or false. And it's not an argument. You could have a picture of an argument or picture of a claim, but by itself, images are not true or false. Using the terms, strictly. We could talk about the image is true in the sense that it's real or false in the sense that it's faked. So images can be, grainy, blurry, neutral, provocative, misleading, inappropriate, emotionally powerful, etc. But they're neither, again, strictly speaking, they're neither true nor false, and they're not arguments. Also, images themselves are not premises like in an argument. True, like in courtrooms, they'll often present like an image as evidence in the legal sense, but that's not evidence in the sense of being a premise. Now, an image can, of course, serve as a basis for a claim. You could have, obvious examples like in a court situation, they could have footage from a video camera showing someone, committing a crime, like someone attacking, a police officer attacking a citizen, or a citizen, stealing from a store. And those images could be used to make claims. It wouldn't be that the image itself is an argument or philosophically evidence. What a person would do is make claims about the image and then use that in an argument to argue, for example, guilt. Now, images can be powerful emotionally. They can also function as a form of rhetoric. Now, there's of course nothing wrong about feeling in response to images. But of course, images, do not logically resolve issues by their emotional powers. And again, the whole point of critical thinking, in part, is to resolve issues objectively. And being aware of not to have no feelings, but to make the assessment based on feels, but rather on the basis of thinking. Again, this does not mean becoming a cold, unfeeling, machine. It just means one should not make decisions, rational, logical decisions, based on things intended to sway emotions. So, fake and misleading images, of course, are been a big thing since we've had images, back to the early days of photography. But of course, today, with things like Photoshop, etc., it has become a true art form. So one way an image can be fake or misleading is by deliberately manipulating it, such as adding things, deleting things, combining things. And this can, obviously be used with things like Photoshop to modify still images or other software to modify videos to create things that are quite misleading, showing things, as being there that really aren't there, or moving things, etc. So you'd always want to be aware today of the power of, Photoshop to do these things. One could also have images that are not altered, they're real images, but the captions are misleading. For example, a person may have a picture of like a really powerful emotional image of a picture of blood-stained shoes, children's shoes, and then put a caption under it, attributing it to, some terrorist attack, that occurred. And it could be an image from something totally different. And so recaptioning images is a thing that does occur. So one would want to be aware, is this in fact what the caption references? Camera angles are also a useful way to distort information. You can make a big crowd appear small by moving the camera to capture the back end of a crowd, because typically a crowd, the tail end of a crowd is usually pretty dispersed. If you look at any crowd, the front will be, if there's a big crowd, the front will be pretty well packed, and then the back will be kind of dispersed. So if you want to make a large crowd appear small, angle the camera to catch the back. If you want to make a small crowd appear large, angle the camera just to catch the front. Also, kind of concern are images that may be like real, but they have no name or credentials, so you don't know where they come from. Stills can, of course, also be taken from movies. Pictures can be taken from TV shows. This used to be typically done just to kind of like troll people. I remember the TV show Lost, like when the plane broke, was splitting apart. People were sending around pictures from it saying, scene captured moments before people plunged to their death. And of course, people would know, would say that's from a TV show. Back before, Photoshop and 3D modeling, people would take pictures using actual like little models, trying to fake things. Maybe they still do, but today would be 3D fakes. One could also have pictures that are staged, and thanks to technology today, they can be complete fabrications. The best known of which are probably the deep fakes, where they could have images that seem to be and sound like someone, typically someone famous. These were often used, not surprisingly, for pornography, but they could be used for other nefarious purposes, such as creating attacks on politicians, or even less likely normal people. So one should always be quite wary about images, especially with today's technology. So that takes us to the end of chapter 5. And so the quick recap of chapter 5 includes the concepts of persuasion, which is about essentially influencing people. Rhetoric is aimed at emotive power, and psychological force is different from logical force. Logical force is the ability to prove or support a claim. Psychological is how how it makes us either feel or alters kind of our, mental states in a non-logical way. In terms of the rhetorical devices we looked at, you'd want to know for each of these the basic definition, and there's a handy recap here in the PowerPoint, and then be aware of like clear examples. A good typical thing I do is have multiple choice questions and have like an example of one, and you pick which one that best fits it. And we looked at euphemisms, making the neutral or bad seem good, dissonances doing the reverse, weaslers, protecting claims by weakening them, downplaying, making something seem less important, the stereotypes, innuendo, loaded questions, ridicule, hyperbole, rhetorical definitions and explanations, rhetorical analogies, misleading comparisons, and of course proof surrogates and repetition. And then we finished up with these devices and a bit about images. So next time we'll head on to chapter 6, and we'll start looking at fallacies, which are bad arguments. They go beyond rhetoric, and they're even worse. So stay safe, and I'll see you in the future.